VC-10 was, I liked it because I thought the engine layout was unusual, and it was, I thought, very satisfactory. Passengers seemed to love the noise of the VC-10, or the lack of, I should say. People complained of VC-10 being noisy outside, but for passenger comfort, it took a lot of beating, and it was a pilot's airplane. Pilots loved it. The finest aircraft ever built, in my opinion. Certainly the finest I ever flew. It was, if I had to describe it, I'd call it overpowered perfection. It had huge engines, flew beautifully. You could do as much with it on one engine almost as you could do on two. I used to give an air display where I did a loop on two engines, feathered one, did a loop on one, then feathered them both and did a loop on no engines, just through the momentum of coming from the previous loop. It was, wonderful airplane. A virtuoso, I would say, of slow flying. It was unbelievable what it could do at low speed. And a perfect airplane to be with the army in the field, for spotting for them, taking messages from one unit to another, all that sort of thing. Army cooperation, a perfect airplane in that sense. Well, this was Germany's great fighter. It frightened the life out of the RAF when it first appeared, because it appeared about a good year before the Spitfire 9. And we lost a lot of Spitfires in that year. They just could not cope with this airplane, which was a huge jump forward from the Spitfire 5. But once the 9 appeared, the Spitfire 9, things levelled out. And I would say the two of them were pretty evenly matched. And combat, frankly, would, I think, depend on this. The outcome would depend on the skill of the pilot. But they were pretty near. It was Germany's greatest fighter, just as the Spitfire was ours. Now, this strange airplane, when you fly it, you suddenly realize you've got to understand the Japanese philosophy of combat. They send their pilots out to kill, and they're there for no other purpose. They are not to defend themselves. They are meant to fight to the death. When you get in this airplane, the thing that strikes you is there's no bulletproof windscreen, there's no armour plating around you, there are no self-sealing fuel tanks, and you cannot jettison the hood. You're in a tin coffin, and that's where you're meant to be, as far as the Japs are concerned. That's their philosophy. And one must remember that to them, to be taken prisoner of war is the ultimate disgrace. Maybe that goes some way to explain their behaviour with our prisoners of war, but it's like that. But leaving these things aside, as a pure airplane, it was a phenomenally manoeuvrable airplane, very tight turning circle. And remember this, from the outset of the war till mid-1943, this was the finest fighter in the world on its record. And it was only when the Hellcat, Grumman Hellcat, arrived in the Far East that things changed. So this is really an outstanding low-level airplane, because the Far Eastern War was fought at low level, whereas the European eventually was fought at high level. Sea Fury, another beauty. It arrived after the war, but it had everything: power, maneuverability, and quite rugged in its own way, too, to withstand combat damage. Of course, post-war, it has had a wonderful record in the field of aviation racing. In America, it's used in the Reno air races and has had great success, although one must say, not always with the Centaurus engine. They have powered it with some of the bigger engines than that, but every American who's flown it has the highest praise for it. I mean, for its handling. It is a delightful airplane. The Americans brought out at the same time the Grand Bearcat, and the two, if you had a combat with them, again, it'd be like the 190 and the Spitfire. It'd be the skill of the pilot that would tell. Phantom, one of the great fighters of all time. In its day, it was head and shoulders above anything that was around. And it's had a long life. It's a wonderful record, both of combat, what should I say, efficiency, particularly in the Vietnamese War. And it's an airplane that suited both the Air Force and the Navy. It's pretty near perfect. Strangely enough, the saying goes that if it looks good, it flies good. When you see the Phantom with everything down, ready to land, it certainly doesn't look good. But by God, it flies well. Fast, of course, but very easy to control. Very easy. I found it I put it as one of, I would say, apart from the high landing speed, which means you have to think a little bit faster, it had all the other assets you wanted from a naval airplane. Yes, I went on a posting which was really to build up the German naval air arm, because during World War II, Goering had insisted that everything that flies comes under his control. So the German naval air arm was really had denuded of its own power. And at the end of the war, they were left high and dry, of course, and as an effort to get them back into business, they appealed to NATO that if they could reform a German naval air arm, that they would be happy to assign it to NATO. So my job was to take quite a smattering, or even more than a smattering, a leavening of World War II pilots, together with an intake of the new generation of post-war pilots, and meld them all together into a force that we could assign to NATO. They had British aircraft, Seahawk, Gannet, as their main aircraft, and they were very adaptable, particularly the young ones. The older ones who had been in the previous Luftwaffe were a bit set in their ways, frankly. I found them a little more difficult to weld into a force than the young ones. The young ones were really up for the hunt. So that was the only difficult aspect of it, I would say. It was trying to get two generations together. Once at the end of the day, they were a very good fighting force, and I was very proud to hand them over to NATO. They unfortunately, when we finished, I had recommended to them that they continue thereafter with Buccaneers, which would have been ideal, I think. But the German manufacturers ganged up on the German services and insisted on having the F-104 Starfighter. The reason for this was the German industry realized they had been out of the game. They weren't allowed to manufacture until quite a while after the war was over. And they wanted to get back into the Mach 1, the supersonic league, in one jump. And they risked all and said, we'll have the F-104. Now, the services weren't happy with this. And, of course, there were a couple of things against them. To begin with, the version of the F-104 was called an all-purpose version, and it was 1,000 kilograms, that's 2,000 pounds, heavier than the American 104. Also, the Americans realized this was a tricky ship to fly, and they wouldn't let anybody touch it with less than 1,500 hours. The Germans were sending pilots in with 400 hours. They didn't have anybody with the modern aviation with 1,500 hours. And furthermore, these guys had only flown in the blue skies of Texas in their training, and when it came to Europe and the European weather and a difficult aeroplane and a heavier aeroplane, recipe for disaster. And what happened? They had almost 150 crashed, of which 50% of the crashes were fatal. Disaster in every sense of the word. Oh, it was very tricky. You had to have your wits about you. It was tricky in bad weather. It was a sensitive, very sensitive aircraft, and of course very high wing loading. But if you had an emergency and bad weather on your hands, you really needed a crackerjack pilot there to deal with it. There were denazification courts set up to look at these people before they were chosen to assume NATO posts. But I am not totally convinced that this was effective. There were some people, I certainly met some, that I would not have recommended that they be given the jobs they were given, because they were difficult to handle and often showed sparks of resentment about what had happened in the past. By that I mean about what Britain had done to Germany in the past. And they were still, I would have said they were still, in their off moments, Nazi sympathizers. And this was not good for morale. But we only had to wait about 5 years or 10 years, and they disappeared, and the young generation moved into place. But to give you an example of some of the things that happened, Bubi Hartmann, who was the top scorer in the whole Luftwaffe with 352 kills, was a prisoner of the Russians at the end of the war. So he had 10 years in Russia. And when he came out, I had a chat with him, and I asked him, he's very interesting, I asked him, how did he ever get scores like that? And he said, well, you have to realize that all my flying, and it literally was all, was on the Eastern Front. And in one airplane, the Me-109. Different marks of the 109, but only in the 109. And he said the naivety, tactical naivety of the Russians was unbelievable. He said they would come out with huge formations of Aviation 2 aircraft, the Stormovik, and they would fly just straight and level in large gaggles and think that the one pea shooter they had at the back, which was a 1.3 gun, would save them because they had a lot of them. He said they barely bothered us at all in the 109. He said, I wouldn't fire until their aircraft totally filled my windscreen. And then I'd only need a few bullets to shoot one down. And he said, in one sortie, he said, I've got as many as 6 aircraft in one sortie because I used so little ammunition by getting right virtually up their tails. And he said they never budged, they just sat there with firing with a silly little gun at the back, if the guy hadn't already been killed. And he said there were a lot of women pilots amongst these. Not that he was denigrating what the women did, but he said it goes to show that they were getting down to using women for this type of work. So they must have been short of pilots anyway. And anyway, when he came out, he went into the Luftwaffe. But before I did that, I should tell you, I said to him, were you on the Eastern Front the entire time? He said, no, I had 1 month on the Western Front. And he said, I realize I am incredibly lucky to have survived it. He said it was a different ball game altogether. He said I didn't shoot down one aircraft on the Western Front, and he said I was lucky I wasn't shot down at least a couple of times. So he said that the two theatres were as different as chalk from cheese. And then he went into Luftwaffe, but having passed the denazification, and I think I would have agreed with that, and made a lieutenant colonel, but he was driven out of it by professional jealousy of his comrades, so-called, in the Luftwaffe. Yes, now this was interesting. It was quite a while after Doenitz had come out of his 10 years in prison, after the Nuremberg trials. And I was in the Naval Air Arm at this time, and a submarine ace up at Kiel, where we were based, had died, so there was to be a big funeral for him. And the Naval Air Arm were going to turn out, and I asked our Consul General what I should do, since I was part of the fleet of the Naval Air Arm, so to speak. And he asked back in England, and they said, go. So I lined up with all the other guys, and Doenitz went to the funeral. And afterwards, he came along and shook hands with every chap who had been there who was in uniform. And he just went along shaking hands, saying, nice to see you, or something similar. And he came to me and shook hands, nice to see you, and went on. And he'd gone 3 past me when he suddenly, something clicked, and he realized I wasn't in German uniform. So he came back, and he said, you're British, aren't you? And I said, yes, all this in German. And he said, what are you doing here? And I said, well, I'm training in the Naval Air Arm, and we've all come to pay our respects to a war hero. And he said, oh, that's very kind, thank you very much. And just went on. But when he got to the end of the line, and before stepping into his car, they all broke ranks and rushed over to surround him at his car. And in those days, you weren't allowed to cheer any ex-Nazi leader. So they didn't say a word, but they all took their hats off, as they do for the normal 3 cheers, hip, hip, hooray, and did this 3 times, but in complete silence. It's quite eerie. It was a time of the state visit of the Queen, her first to Germany, post-war Germany, and the enthusiasm for her was incredible. Right along the Rhine, they had painted on the banks of the Rhine, "Welcome to our Queen," because, of course, as you know, the family, a Battenberg family, are of German origin. But that does not involve our present Queen of etc. They're of the Windsors. And there were tremendous enthusiasm shown for her. But again, it gave me a chance to meet some of the new heads of state. For example, the new president of Germany, and Adenauer, who was the chancellor, Erich, who was the chancellor. Oh, and one really got into the inner circle there. And I think they were genuinely working for a new Germany, of which they would be proud of, which would be of the kind that Britain wanted. They were not going to go the same route again. I'm quite convinced of that. Not many of them knew my background. But one remark that said, if we had known then what we know now, we would certainly have not allowed you and your car out of Germany. But apart from joking about it like that, they really didn't connect. I didn't talk about it much, and I didn't think it was the right thing to do in diplomatic circles, because inevitably they do not like to hear talk about the SS. This is interesting because I lecture in Germany today. I've been there fairly recently. And when I lectured 25 or 30 years ago, to a different generation, really, they didn't want to hear about any of the nasty things that went on. I was told never to mention any of the concentration camps, never to mention Hitler or Goering or Himmler or any of these people. And this time when I went, I took the same stance. I wasn't mentioning it, but they were a young generation, and they asked me to talk about Goering and Himmler, whom I interrogated, and it was quite different scene. And some of the people, some of the scientists I interrogated were remarkable people. We brought 26 back to Britain, of which we had to let them go. They were all prisoners of war, but you could only keep them for 2 years. That was the rule. So in mid-1947, they were to be released. But we offered them places at Farnborough as high-ranking civil servants if they would stay. And only 2 of them took it up. And they were the best 2. And one, of course, was the remarkable Dr. Kucherman, who really was the catalyst for Concord. So we really scored very well out of that. But they were very high-grade scientists. With the wind tunnel backgrounds they had, of course, they were unbeatable in their own field. To begin with, motivation, obviously, is the first. If you're not motivated, you're never going to want to fly. Secondly, once you have, if that gets you there, I think you have got to believe that you're doing something that is going to take your full interest. you're not doing it because it's fashionable or because you think, oh, you know, this is a good sideline to have with the girls or anything like that. You have got to believe that you're hoping to take it even further than just ordinary flying. That, of course, the only way you take it further is either you go into civil aviation as an airline pilot or you go into the services. So I think if you get to the stage where you're thinking about either going civil or service, you have reached, the motivation has been there, and then you're going to have to step up another gear. And that means you've got to improve your skills, particularly in blind flying. And that is usually a hurdle that brings a lot down, because it's not everybody takes kindly to that. But without it, I mean, you can neither operate in the two fields we just talked about. You'll only be a fun private pilot. So, as I say, motivation, good reactions, which you'll be tested for anyway. And if you want to go into something like test flying, I think a realization of what you're taking on, that you're not going into something just to fly different interesting airplanes. You're moving into a profession that has an element of risk in it that you've got to be prepared to face up to. Most of the really brilliant combat pilots were good shots. It was a hobby of theirs. For example, Johnny Johnson on our side was a very good shot. Galland and Bubi Hartmann were both great shots with rifles, hunting people, really. So that is a great asset, because every fighter pilot goes through this unless he's been a good shot. There comes a period just after you've qualified where you don't think your camera gun shots show that you're not going to hit anything. And suddenly, when you're feeling pretty desperate about getting a hang of it all, it clicks. But this was our problem in the Battle of Britain. The guys who had been good shots before worked out well, but the number of young people we lost in the Battle of Britain were the guys that hadn't had the time to get over that period of, well, as we said, you couldn't hit a bull in the ass with a snow shovel. And that's the period that is very difficult.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.